Wonderful.
Well, I find myself in a very strange position where I can't see anybody. I'm just sitting in a little office looking at a screen, and someone tells me that there may be an audience out there in front of me. I wish I could see you, and I wish I had been able to come and meet you personally and be with you on an occasion which I think is very, very important. But I'm sorry about my samud. Not so great at the beginning of the week, but I'm perfectly capable, I hope, of surviving giving this talk. Oh, look, there's a whole bunch of people. Hello, everybody. Oh, it's delightful to see you all wave. Ah, terrific. Thank you. That makes me feel happy. I love to see an audience. Great stuff. Okay, well, thank you for waiting for this. I'm here to talk to you about the global importance of El Jable for the African Houbara. And I'm in my capacity as the co-chairman of the UICN Bustard Specialist Group. So before we go, I would like to just give you a little introduction to the fabulous bustards. They really are an astonishing little family. There's only 26 species on the planet, but they're all magnificent in their way. Of course, all birds are wonderful, but these are particularly spectacular creatures, and they're very unusual in many respects. This one in front of you is the great bustard that lives in Spain, goes right the way across Asia to China. But it's a wonderful bird. It's wonderful when you look at it like this, but you have to wait to see what it looks like when it actually goes into display. It is quite astonishing. But first, a few words about bustards more generally. One of the odd things about them is that they have no preen gland. A preen gland creates oil. Most birds, almost all birds, have this gland, which they use for cleaning and waterproofing their feathers. But bustards live in such dry country that they have no need, really, for waterproofing. So they live in open, dry habitats. They live on mostly grasshoppers, beetles, and ants. And so they have a short bill for being able to pick up these medium-sized to small insects. They have a long neck to reach for them, long legs to cover the ground to catch them. And they're large-bodied, which means that they're quite good to eat, especially for local predators. And that makes them, in a certain degree, very vulnerable. The larger the body, the more desirable you are as a food. But they have no hind toe because they've walked so much on the land that they have lost the use of a hind toe. Hind toes are very valuable in birds, and most birds have them. But it means that bustards are unable to perch in trees. That's an important evolutionary step. It seems small, but it's huge, because it means they must nest and roost on the ground. And roosting on the ground, spending half the day, night on the ground, means you are very vulnerable to the threat of predation, as you are when you're nesting. This means that they are highly vigilant animals. They have a great wariness of people and wariness of anything strange in their environment. They do not like it. They like calm, peace, and consistency. And one of the characteristics of being highly vigilant is that they have 360-degree vision. And 360-degree vision means that their eyes are set really absolutely on the sides of the head so that they could see everywhere. More so even than many other birds like chickens and ducks. Their eyes are just designed to see every point of the horizon. That's an advantage for survival, but it's a disadvantage if you're flying fast, flying forward towards an unseeable, small but fatal obstacle. And we'll come back to that in a minute. And because they're highly vigilant, they're very hard to study. So oddly enough, we know very little about them. And because they're so wary of people, they see you before you see them, and you modify their behavior just by being in their presence. So this makes it very, very difficult to observe and to understand. And so they've been a very neglected group for many years. This is our great bustard in display, and it's an astonishing transformation. It's probably the best display, the most convoluted display of any bird species. It has a neck sac which inflates like a balloon, and then it twists its wings and its tail so that they're in this extraordinary position. And I can't explain it in too much detail, it's not time, but in this picture, the tip of the tail and the tip of the wings of the bird are behind its head. So this is an extraordinary contortion this bird is doing. Now, I know of no other bird which is quite so convoluted in the way it attracts a female. This is a little bustard, which is a little bit easier. This simply does a lovely jump, and it's got this beautiful pattern of the white V and the white crescent on a black background, and no other bird in the world has got a pattern like that. Then there's Denham's bustard from southern and central Africa, which has blows its neck up into this huge football and walks around slowly, waiting to attract a female. But this is a magnificent ruff of feathers. A relative of it, the Huygens bustard from northeast Africa, doesn't have such a big neck to blow up, but it still does produce a small football effect and stands very upright with this very elegant plumage and this lovely pattern on its head, and gives a little chirrup to attract a female. The Nubian bustard in the Sahel in central North Africa struts around in prairies with its front feathers blown out, very much like the hubara, coming over its face so that it can't properly see where it's going, or so it seems. But it's got a forked tail, and it lays its wingtips between the forks and the tail as it struts. There's no other structure in the bird world which is like this one. And this display was only discovered 3 years ago, when this particular photograph was taken. And it's quite an astonishing evolved condition. The Bengal florican in India is black with a brown back, but when it displays, it has this wonderful set of white wings, and they fly up or drop down, and they're also inflating the front of their feathers, so that when they drop down, they look like a front-heavy helicopter as they come into land. A wonderful display. A close relative, the lesser florican, does just a little jump, like the little bustard that we saw earlier. This bird has got these lovely little moustachial feathers that wave around as it jumps up and down. And take a look at this bird, because you won't ever see it in the wild. It's going to go extinct, probably in the next 5 years. The Indian government, the Indian authorities, do not know how to save this animal. And I'm afraid to say it is just too complicated for it to be saved. It's a staggeringly lovely bird, and we're going to lose it this decade. In Africa, we have 2 crested bustards, which have this wonderful way of displaying feathers at the back of their head or on the side of their faces, which are not displayed, but they're just resting normally. And these are rather gorgeous ways in which males court females. In southern Africa, we have the blue bustard, which makes most of its display by making an awful lot of noise with its mouth open, like here, but these lovely colours that it uses as it flies around its territory. And then the black bustard, which is also in South Africa, but it's not all black, it's just called that, but you can see it's black, white, zebra patterned, red, and yellow. So this is a very splendid bird indeed as well. So that's just a little trip around some of the bustards and how wonderful they are. The message is bustards are totally fabulous and utterly irreplaceable. With the hubara, there are two species. There's the one in Africa, which is the one you have here in Lanzarote, and then there's one in Asia. You can see that they are essentially very similar, but they do have, particularly when they're displayed, quite significant differences in the amount of feathers in their heads. And also, if you look at the shoulder of the African one and the shoulder of the Asian one, you see that the pattern of black and white is quite different. And also, position of the back of the Asian one is up rather than down. And that's because the African one moves very fast when it displays. The Asian one is much more leisurely and walking slowly and trotting. So actually, the displays make them very obviously very different species. I show you the range of the Asian hubara first, and I do so simply to indicate that this is a bird which has almost its entire range inside Islamic countries. And that's very important because the people who most hunt it are themselves Arabs, and they go to all these countries in order to hunt. The only one they don't go to is Israel. And the same is the case, the equivalent case in Africa, where we have again a distribution of the African bustard hubara, which is entirely in Islamic countries, except for the Canary Islands. Although you can see how tiny the Canary Islands are in relation to the size of the range of the hubara, and you could just pick up Fuerteventura and Lanzarote and drop them into the northern Sahara, and they would kind of disappear. Nonetheless, the population that you have in these islands is absolutely right to the good survival of the African hubara, and we'll come back to why that is later. I first got interested in, I was first made chairman of the Bustard Specialist Group back in 1978, and I immediately started looking at the status of the hubara in the Canaries. At that time, not since 1920 had any real attention been devoted to it, and we weren't sure if the bird was really surviving still at the time that I became chairman. So I organized an expedition. I didn't go on it myself, but I organized it, funded it, to go in 1979 to both islands to see what its status was, and we published the report in Bustard Studies. I just include here the first page of an article I wrote on the history of the bird in the Canaries, and you'll see that the very first reference, or the very first article, publication or document about Fuerteventura 600 years ago includes mention of the word bustards in French, butard. So they were here 600 years ago, so they're going to be here in another 600 years' time. But my expedition didn't find many, only 42 on Fuerteventura, 7 on Lanzarote, estimating populations of 80 to 100 and 15 to 20 on respective islands. That's not a lot, and it was a sign that something was wrong. Either that it was wrong with the hubara, or it was wrong with my expedition for not finding more because they weren't very good observers. We weren't totally sure, but we thought we'd done a reasonably good job. Eventually, in fact, the evidence came to show that we did do a reasonable job. But why was the hubara so rare in the 20th century? Well, the answers are only given in the literature. One of them is that it was because of hunting for food and sport, especially for horseback. And that's almost certainly the case. Lots of different ornithologists visiting the Canaries found this to be true. Also, they reported that children took eggs. These would be children who would be herding goats and so on in the desert, in the semi-desert. And as well as that, if you found a resident in the eggs were too set to eat, then you could always snare the female on the nest instead. So the productivity was heavily suppressed that way. too. And one observer said that he found boys who just broke the eggs and they told him, we don't know why we do it, but we always do. Whether that's true or not is not completely sure, but that was one other explanation that was given. And then this comes from Carmen Portelli herself. She told me that she met a farmer a few years ago who told her that 40 years ago, farmers routinely used to put down poison for birds to protect their crops, and hubaras would have suffered as a consequence. Whether that's true or not, or whether that was widespread or just done by a few rogue farmers, we really don't know. It's the kind of thing that they wouldn't have boasted about at the time, so it's a very difficult thing to find out. Perhaps more farmers would be candid about it these days if they were asked. But probably the best explanation is that it was overgrazing. Too many of different types of grazing and browsing animals. 6,000 camels on Fuerteventura in 1900. Many more goats, donkeys, mules and horses also in both islands. So without doubt, these would have grazed down the vegetation much lower than it is now. And that would have made hunting easier and the finding and taking of eggs easier as well. And as well as actually also preventing the birds from getting so much food. So that would have been a big suppressant. And since our visit in 1979, the grazing pressure has become less and less, and the population, it seems, has risen almost in line with the way that pressure has been eased. I here just show you the foot of Houbara. Apart from the fact that it doesn't have a hide toe, you also notice that he's got these very thick pads on his feet, unlike other bustards. This is because they are heavily adapted for walking on very soft sand. I gained comfort from Juan Carlos Alonso's work. He did some work on behalf of a power line company a few years ago to see what the status of the Houbara was. Very, very useful work indeed. He came up, one of the things that he did was to come up with a genetic analysis. And this showed that there was indeed a genetic bottleneck, and that this bottleneck could be explained by human-induced historical population declines. So that indicates very strongly that there really was, at the time of my expedition, a population which was had gone through or was still going through a genetic bottleneck. So what are the Houbara's likes and dislikes? One of the members of that expedition of mine, Aurelio Martin, 15 years later, did a study of the bustard on Lanzarote. One of his findings, very simple, was this one: that the birds select those areas which present a higher vegetation. So taller vegetation was obviously becoming available and the birds were using it. Another sign that overgrazing had been a problem. Also a study done in the mid-1990s looking at how usable farmland, that the gavies were. So cultivated gavies were selected because of their alfalfa, abandoned ones because of their herbaceous cover, and ploughed ones because of their total vegetation cover. So at that time, at any rate, traditional farms still were extremely important. I think they still are today. However, we also, Matt Geary, who's in the audience, please buy him a beer afterwards. He'll be your friend for life. We had a student, Joe Cooper, who came to the island in 2020. Unfortunately, his research was cut off by COVID, and it was also made problematic by the drought that was there that year. So he wasn't able to gather a great deal of data, but what he did gather showed that Houbara's favour the vicinity of small-scale agriculture and abandoned farmland. So it's not just open desert that they like. However, they avoid areas with higher levels of human land use. So again, our findings consistent with what other people were finding. The Alonsos found something slightly different. They were able to put satellite transmitters on their birds. The consequence of that was they could monitor them much more accurately. They found that most of the time, in the breeding season, the birds didn't use cultivated land. But outside the breeding season, they did. So that was quite an important finding. And it again shows that cultivation is important and not to be neglected in considering the conservation of the species. Putting the satellite tags on the birds meant that they were able to get an awful lot of other kinds of data. And one of the things they found was, which we actually knew from studies on the Asian hubara, was that most of their movements are made at night. This in particular is important and dangerous for them if there are a lot of power lines around. And what they found was that there were collisions. Everyone's found this, as we'd see. And they were recommending, as a consequence, of burying electric and telephone lines. We'll see just why that is, because the power line threat to bustards is really extreme. And it's a new one. This is not something that existed 30 or 40 years ago, but it really does now. This is a photograph taken in Ethiopia on a particular plain where Kori bustards gather. Kori bustards are the biggest bustards in the world. They are the biggest flying birds in the world. They're 3/4 the height of a man when they stretch up, and they're very heavy. When it doesn't matter how big or small a power line is. This is just a tiny distribution line. And it looks like a telephone wire. When the bustards come to this plain to breed, they gather in quite large numbers. And I calculate that one Kori bustard dies a week, killed on this one line. And here's a Kori bustard killed on a big line in South Africa. Here's a Ludwig's bustard killed on one line in South Africa. What a dreadful, dreadful death. But not all birds stay on the line. Here is a great bustard hitting a power line in Hungary. And if it isn't killed on impact, it will have its wing broken, it will fall to the ground, and it will die on impact. These are dreadful, dreadful things, and it's happening all the time. This is the Great Indian bustard. There are only 100 left. Like the lesser florican, they will be extinct within 10 years. And this one has died only a few years ago. This photograph was taken. And this hit this line, which is fitted with what are called bird flight diverters, which are mechanisms designed to make the power line more visible so that the birds won't hit them. But busters don't see them. They're heavy birds, they're flying relatively fast, and they're unmaneuverable. So that means they'll just hit the wires anyway, and they'll die. Only 100 of these birds left, and they live in a habitat like that. This bird is going to go extinct in the next 10 years. That's 2 out of the 26 species gone. And the lesser florican is also being killed on power lines everywhere. A study done in 2008 in the Canary Islands found considerable damage being done to hubaras. It wasn't noticed beforehand. But look at these figures, particularly spring 2008 for L. Lanzarote. 28 birds found under power lines and 18 found in the autumn. That's 46 birds in 2 out of 4 seasons being killed by power lines. That's unsustainable. That's an extraordinary number. And what the authors then say is, to minimize hubara collision rates, there's a lot of endeavor needed, particularly in the northern plains of Lanzarote, i.e. Jable. Even telephone wires can kill hubaras. And here again, we look at this survey of wires, and we see that 36 birds were killed by telephone wires in Lanzarote, much more than in Fuerteventura. And that's over 20% of the entire number of birds that were killed in this survey. The power line density and habitat quality were looked at by the Alonso team. And they came up with slightly different judgment, and I don't think that these are irreconcilable. But what they looked at on Fuerteventura is the number of display size of hubaras. 83 of them were present on Fuerteventura at the end of the 1990s. At the beginning of the 2020s, there were only 29, a 65% drop in 23 years, which is an astonishing reversal. They attributed that to a strong effect of aridification, and then also power line density is the second most important factor. I'm not sure whether aridification can be blamed that much. I definitely think that there is an effect. I don't doubt that for a minute. But what they also found was that extant display sites had lower densities of human infrastructure like buildings and roads. And I think that's a key to one of the reasons why so many display sites might have disappeared. Roads in particular, I think, have a big impact, a much bigger effect than we really understand. One of those effects is very direct. This is a roadkill in Lanzarote a few years ago. A terrible thing to happen. And there was a study done in 2018 looking at the nature of the problem in Lanzarote, and the hubara was amongst the birds affected. An important threat, newly identified and regarded as a source of mortality that might have demographic effects. I think that is perfectly true, but probably more important is just the presence of a road, especially a busy road. Look at this work by Claudia Schuster and Luis Carrascal, where they found that the density in one site went down in 1994 from 2.3 hubaras per square kilometre to 0 by 2006 as a consequence of a road being built. So busy roads are definitely a no-no for hubaras. And equally, sand spores have a major inhibiting effect on their presence. Again, the Alonso team looked at this. They also had an interesting insight into what happened during COVID. They found that either side of COVID, the flights by hubaras were 325% greater, more than they were during COVID. And they attribute that to the presence of tourists and vehicles in the hubara areas, causing them to fly. And of course that would be putting them in greater danger of hitting a power line or a telephone line. So tourist development and vehicles in the desert could well be a significant problem. I don't doubt there is at all. I would just say that locals obviously also drive in the desert or go in the desert, so there will be an effect not just in tourists but also local folk. And the other thing is that in that year there was a drought, and I imagine that many birds would have been stressed to the point where they perhaps would not have flown if they were disturbed, simply because they didn't want to lose the energy needed to do so, and they would just go and hide behind a bush instead. One of the studies that they did, the Alonso team, was look at display site selection. Just one finding of interest from our point of view in that is that display sites were farther away than random from sources of human disturbance. So again, the same narrative. Disturbance is not something bustards tolerate. And then there's sand mining. And this is such an obvious form of disturbance. Road disturbance, you think, well, that can't be so bad. Sand mining obviously is. Here's the sand distribution of sand in Lanzarote, and particularly in Jable de Arriba. This area is part of a natural park. It's a special zone for conservation. It's a special protection area for birds, and is part of the biosphere reserve that is Lanzarote. All this protection, you would think, would be something that meant that we cherished El Jable. And indeed, the Lanzarote government, the tourist department, promotes El Jable as Lanzarote's secret treasure. There's some irony in that, isn't there? Here's the date. Less than 2 years ago, they were calling it their secret treasure. And yet, it is starved by this monumental amount of sand mining. Here it is. All that red is what's being lost to sand mining. And it looks like this. It looks pretty terrible. And the really awful thing about it is that if you dig down to the hard core, to this clay compact core, it doesn't support any vegetation at all. Nothing can recover. So this is basically land that has been lost forever, unless we can restore it by covering it again with sand, which is, I suspect, not possible, but is certainly not going to be an easy task. I think we need Hercules around to help do it. You could dig up the surface of the El Jable and farm it, and that's compatible. If it's done in an ecologically sustainable way, that's compatible with the Houbara at any rate. And there's this interesting fact: sand extracted from one area, it could be worth 17,000 euros, but you'll never get it back again, just a once-off. But if you've planted with sweet potatoes, 14,500 euros, not quite so much, but you get it every 2 years forever. Thank you to Marta Peña and Jaime Gil for that important piece of information, and greetings to them. So the Canary Houbara rise and fall. These are the figures for how it is done over the years since my expedition. My expedition, you remember, found 80 to 100 birds, Fuerteventura, 15 to 20 in Lanzarote. And if you look down those columns, you can see the figures going up, up, and up until we get to 460 almost for Fuerteventura 20 years ago. And also 20 years ago, you get as many as conceivably 800, probably around 500 for Lanzarote. Great recovery. That's fantastic news. And you see that in the case of Lanzarote, that population has so far been sustained. It's a tiny population by global standards, but it's a very important population. 450 birds, absolutely vital. Whereas Fuerteventura has gone down to 97. That number is in the range of my team had 46 years ago. So there's been a massive decline in numbers in Fuerteventura. Can that be recovered? I hope so, but I doubt it, because I think there's too many changes have taken place. So we have to do everything we can to defend the bird in Lanzarote. There's been some modelling and predicting done, again with Luis Carrascal as one of the authors. They found in 50 years up to 2011 that land uptake at increasing new rows had lost the Houbara around 30% of its habitat. And they predicted that by 2025, this year, there would have been another 20% lost. And that might be true. It seems to be true in Fuerteventura. So that's one prediction. And then we look at what the Alonso team came up with after looking at their mortality figures. They found that population viability models used in their data predicted the extinction of the species in the Canaries in 50 years. That's a pretty serious judgment. And we have to make sure that that prediction does not come true. Why are the Canaries so important? Believe it or not, it's because of this man. This is the founder of the state of the United Arab Emirates, Sheikh Zayed Al Nahyan. And when he was a young man, he went falconing with Wilfred Thesiger, the great explorer, who took his photograph. And here he is sitting on a camel with one falcon. And of course, he then became the leader of what turned into an oil-rich state. And the consequence of that is, while he wanted to preserve the tradition of Arab falconry, and the hubara is a very important part of that tradition, nonetheless, in the modern age, when you could buy anything, you could buy yourself a different kind of camel, which can go much faster, much farther, and be air-conditioned as well. And so you get into the desert, you could go anywhere, you can kill any number of birds, you can fly your falcons anywhere in the world, in the Islamic world, and you can have as many falcons as you like to go and hunt the hubaras. And so when it comes to hunting hubaras, the chances are rather like the differences in size between the birds in these pictures. The falcon has huge advantages over the hubara. If one falcon gets tired, they just take out another falcon and send that one after the tiring hubara. It's completely unfair, and the consequence is inevitable. It's that all the time. Birds being killed, and killed. So alarming was the situation that with the Asian hubara, there was some work done. There was more work being done in Asia than in Africa on this. At one point, they found up to a 30% annual decline rate in the number of hubaras in certain parts of its range in Central Asia. This is a really staggering and frightening situation. The true response, I think, ought to be different. The one response to this that was offered and taken was captive breeding. Captive breeding on a massive scale. You can throw more and more and more money at captive breeding. You don't have to do the difficult business of preserving landscapes and habitats. You just breed all birds. And here in Bissau, in Morocco, they are being bred in tens of thousands. You could see from this is like a factory farm. It's industrial scale. It's very impressive in many ways. But then it has cost over $1 billion. So it's a major undertaking. And the birds get released whenever someone wants to go hunting, or whenever they feel an area needs to be restocked. They put birds out in very large numbers, that the expectation is that they will reseed the habitat. And again, this is done by the Emirates organization, the International Fund for Houbara Conservation. Captive breeding has taken off in a major way, and here it is, just the number of centers now across the two Houbaras range. You see, up to 19 at the time this was published in 2021. My co-chair of the Bustard Specialist Group, Mimi Kessler, tells me that there are now 35 breeding centers. But they're not doing anything about the habitat, which is the concerning thing. Meanwhile, they also have domestication risks. The birds are very commonly bred in close proximity to people, and they're not afraid of them. This is not the way for a bird to be able to survive well in the wild when it is released. But not only that, but there are other things that captive breeding does to a bird population. There's little been published about the hubara, perhaps for obvious reasons. But just for example, this was published only last month, showing how mallards, species of duck, bred in North America to supplement wild birds to be hunted, are having a major effect, or potentially a major effect, on wild populations, because the different morphological traits that they have are not well adapted to the wild. And they will interbreed with wild birds to reduce fitness, as it says there. Reducing fitness means they're just not able to survive so well. And that is compromising a species. Look at this figure from the International Fund for Houbara Conservation, their annual report for 2022-23, they talk about having bred 76,000 birds, 55,000 to go to Asia, 21,000 to go to Africa. It's all conservation, or releasing for conservation. That's a lot of birds. And yet, if these birds have traits which are not appropriate for living in the wild, then it's potentially compromising the wild birds. I wrote this article in 2022. Where's the hiding place with the Houbara? Where are the reserves? Where are the safe havens? And I just have this little piece of information. 20 years ago, a group of people met to discuss the Houbara status, and 6 biologists from Morocco estimated that the population in their country was 1,240 birds. They were probably wildly wrong. There must have been many more. Even so, that's what they estimated. And yet, looking at the annual reports of the International Fund for Houbara Conservation, you discover that they have released 129,000 birds in Morocco in that time. That is 100 times the number of birds estimated by 6 Moroccan experts. So it's inevitable that there is some really significant problem arising from this. And surely this is what we find. This is a study funded by the International Fund for Houbara Conservation, and it's looking at the effects of putting birds into the wild in Morocco. And what they find in this conclusion is that the restored population still does not meet the criteria for viability. Viability meaning that it can't reproduce itself. It can't manage to survive on its own. If you left it alone, it would fall back and die out. Why? Must be because they have got captive bred genes which are not well enough adapted for the wild. How else do you interpret this sentence? The dependence of the free-ranging population on the continuity of the reinforcement program is an argument for not stopping the releases. This is like saying the dependence of that drug addict on that drug is an argument for not stopping giving that drug to that addict. In other words, it's saying we don't have a solution. All we know is that we've got to keep giving the population these birds in order for them to be able to survive. It's actually a pretty terrifying admission. And that's why the canaries are so important, because we don't know where else these thousands of birds in North Africa have been released and what the damage that they might have done. So what does the canary and Houbara need? It needs taller vegetation by control or cessation of grazing. It needs traditionally low-intensity agriculture only. It needs the burial or removal of killer power lines and phone lines. And the birds need space by control of roads, tracks and buildings and factors that disturb. And therefore we need campaigns and signage to reduce that disturbance at the speed of vehicles across the landscape. And then we need the restoration and complete protection of all of El Jable. Why? 20 years ago, the SEO, BirdLife partner, Hooray, did a study, census of the Houbara in the Canaries, and they found an extraordinarily high density, 12 birds to the square kilometre in El Jable. And they said that El Jable is one of the most important localities for the Houbara in the archipelago. One of the most important. Then they came back in 2020. Sorry, did I say 2020? I meant 2007, or 20 years ago. Came back in 2020, and they did another census. This time, they found, basically, the population in the northeast, around Houbara, in other words, El Jable, is el más importante para la especie. They meant it in terms of in the Canaries. I mean it in terms of the entire species. This is their evidence for why it's so important. Look at this, the distribution of male territories, and you see when they studied the birds, that's what they found. A major concentration in birds in El Jable. So why does El Jable need full protection? For many reasons. But here they are. Aesthetic, an inspiring and unique landscape. Economic, farming yields more in the long term than anything else. Food security, an extremely important consideration in times of drought. Heritage, for a highly evolved land use system, which is really quite remarkable and amazing. Scientific, for the geological, biological uniqueness that this particular area has. And conservation, for the species of national and international importance. And I have to say, obviously, because it's Earth's best last sanctuary for the African hubara. So, muchas gracias.
Mm-hmm.